This is the first time there's a craft it's a reactionless craft. It's a field propulsion craft. And what it does is it creates a distortion in space and time in front of it, where space actually bends. Put a bowling ball in the middle of your bed, and then a foot in front of it, take your fist and push down on the mattress. Bowling balls will roll towards it. And that's exactly how the craft works. It creates a distortion right in front of it, and the craft falls forward.
Maximum velocity achieved. Prepare to fire escape thrusters.
These gravity emitters can be swung all the way up to 180 degrees. And this allows the craft to essentially stand on two of them and hover, while this one swings up and creates distortion in front of it, allowing the craft to slide forward. Element 115 was what we would call the fuel, what provided the power for the reactor to work. Element 115 affects gravity. Element 115 produces its own gravitational energy. It had a very specific manufacturing technique. I don't really know how that information came to be. This fuel is in the form of just a three-dimensional thin triangle, little rounded edges. It's somewhat copper in color.
Somewhat copper in color. Somewhat copper in color.
You know, that reddish, brownish. The way this is manufactured is really critical. It's not just cut out of a heavy sheet of material. A cylinder of this material is taken. This is machined into a cone. So this is, the outer part is shaved off using a lathe or something like that until you have a three-dimensional cone. Once you have the cone, it's sliced like this. And these slices become that. Now even this starting piece, a solid cylinder, is not even a solid cylinder. It consists of many discs stacked up. And these are fused together to produce that. And all of these steps are necessary to produce a successful triangle that brings fuel. This would actually be pieces of all these discs that were cut at unusual angles. Now apparently apparently if you don't do all this, that doesn't work. So this makes no sense anywhere. Just a three-dimensional thin triangle, little rounded edges.
I thought the sound of the fly came from the wings. Not the fly. You see, both of his wings are stuck in the fly trap. How is this possible?
Just a three-dimensional thin triangle, little rounded edges. Just a three-dimensional thin triangle, little rounded edges. Just a three-dimensional thin triangle, little rounded edges. But that's what it takes for it to operate. Now with the alien technology that was present in the craft, it takes that basis, that extra gravitational energy in a small reactor, amplifies it through the equipment there, directs it through the waveguides and archways into the emitters, and allows it to propel the craft and manipulate the gravity wave.
Enter the stars. And so here we are. Months ago, one of the last observations that I made before leaving France was a fly with both of its wings stuck to flypaper. Yet the fly was still able to make a buzzing sound. And we postulated that the sound was due to something else, and that it was something other than the fly's wings that allowed it to levitate. And sure enough, some of you discovered the halter structure just in front of the wings of the fly that vibrate in flight. And we are told that they only help in balance, but I believe that they are the mechanism by which the fly actually levitates off of the ground. The same technology described by Bob Lazar of a UFO. Now, I still had my doubts, but the Most High reveals all, and we know that the fallen ones brought technology from heaven and shared it with all of us against the will of God. The triangular structures that you saw and heard Bob Lazar describe were cut from a cone, and this was used in the reactors of these UFOs to create a dimensional field. Looks exactly like the structures covering the gyroscopic halter on flies and mosquitoes. The same triangular structure. We also see these structures in the scales of the mythical flying animals called dragons. Was this how dragons flew? The book of Genesis states that the dragon would go on its belly. In other words, the inference is that it was grounded from flight. Grounded to the earth. Its ability to fly removed. Now Bob explains that the specific shape of the scale had to be exact. And we know that in some of the images of the ancient dragon images, the scales seem to be more pointed, just like Bob Lazar's description of how a UFO is powered. But now we see snakes and lizards have rounded scales. And maybe this is how they lost their flight. And you heard the sound that the lizard makes, just like a buzzing fly. Is this how the rattlesnake makes its noise and why it makes its rattling noise are these remnants of the Halter flight system. And then when frightened, it's trying to take flight. Nothing is what it seems in this reality, which is why you have to use your own critical thinking to understand the universe that you live in. Now, Bob goes on to describe these beings, these aliens, as kids. That was the nickname that they gave these aliens. And we know that kids is another name for a goat. A baby goat. Now, how does this fit into the overall narrative? Well, of course, we know goat number one is the Baphomet himself. And it's interesting because he also says that these little pieces of this element 115 and these triangular shapes were made out of copper. And we know that copper is toxic to sheep, but necessary for goats. So we have these weird analogies, synchronicities, and overlays regarding the fuel that supposedly powered these spacecraft, according to Bob Lazar. This triangular shape that seems to mimic a layered pyramid upon its completion in manufacturing, and that this, in its specific way that it's manufactured, was the only way that basically a black hole could be produced, through which these craft were able to self-propel themselves by falling into basically another dimension, being pulled through this dimension from another dimension. Now, in watching this documentary, they write this off as the universe theory, that we have this infinite universe and that these are aliens from other planets. And I don't subscribe to that. I believe that this all comes from the fallen ones. And here's the deception. Now, the other thing I noted was this Cavalier's principle, in which stacking of money, coins, is how they demonstrate how these triangular pyramids were created. They were created from a stacked column, and that is right out of the stacked pyramid that's on the dollar bill. The associations are undeniable. The question is what will we do with this information and knowledge? Now that we understand the intricacies and the deeper levels of meaning, that's up to you to decide. Take care and be safe, you guys. I thought the sound of the fly came from the wings.